So do you want me to say some words to start, or how would
Sure,
you like?
go ahead. We're waiting for the first question to roll in. So
Okay. What I offered as a sermon was more like a talk for me. I haven't preached a sermon for a long time. But I think it's important in the act of a community gathering to confront as honestly as possible a text from the Bible. And the Bible is a text from antiquity, so it's really important to understand the Roman Empire and how it worked and how people experienced the world in antiquity, and then to consider what it might mean for us in our own time. And I think when we do this, we can see the humanity of the Bible, and we should be free to question it and to even argue with it or debate with it. And in this particular case, I was debating with Paul. Paul is really tough to understand, I find. And sometimes Paul is very good, and sometimes Paul gets really upset with people. And I think in this particular instance, the writing that we have as 1 Corinthians is Paul answering a letter that was sent to him by the Corinthians, and he has several topics that he addresses. One of them is meat sacrificed to idols. And he sends that letter on, probably with one of his envoys, maybe Titus or somebody who's with him. And then he gets a response from them, which seems to be saying to them, thanks very much, Paul, but quite frankly, we don't want to listen to you or something, or we don't accept what you're saying, or you don't understand us, or some of us have some knowledge here that you don't have. Whatever it is, he's very upset with this response because it seems to question his authority or his status as an apostle, as a representative, we could say, of the anointed. That would be his language, of Christ. So he responds with this great angry letter, which is our 2 Corinthians 10 to 13. And I sometimes joke that when Paul gets this letter from, if you don't mind me swearing slightly, when he gets this letter from the Corinthians in response to what is our 1 Corinthians, his response to that letter is to say, what the hell? I think he's quite upset. So he goes into this big defense of himself. But I tried in the sermon to represent what they might have been saying to him. And one of them is that even though Paul sees the anointed as sort of identifying and being in solidarity with the nations, and he sees the nations as the defeated nations of Rome, and so he can identify the crucifixion with the nations. Nevertheless, in the Corinthians case, they've been part of the Roman Empire for over 100 years now, and they have wealthy people in their congregation who have civic duties, and one of the civic duties they have is to attend festivals. And because they're relatively wealthy, they're probably the ones that provide the houses and the meals for the Christ assembly. So their answer to Paul is probably, thank you very much, but we can't avoid doing these acts. And we know that the idols don't really exist, but we still have to participate in our civic responsibility. Otherwise, we're going to be isolated, and the whole movement is going to be put in jeopardy. So I think that something like that is probably how they're responding. And Paul, I'm not sure if he really understands that to an extent, because he thinks that they can just, eat meat sacrificed to idols at a festival or not do it. And they're not really in a position where they can or can't. So I tried to think in another version of this talk, I tried to think of something similar. And I'm not sure if this is the best example, but in the Presbyterian tradition, a minister of a congregation generally has to go to presbytery, this meeting of presbytery, and you can decide not to go, but if you never go, you're going to be brought into question. There's a certain kind of duty to go, and this is kind of the situation they're in. There's a certain kind of civic obligation to maintain their status, to participate in these rituals that might include meat. So I think their response to Paul is something like this. You know, it's nice that you say these things, but quite frankly, you're not really in the know. And Paul is very upset by this, and he's also thinks that they probably say to him, you know, there's other apostles that tell us different things. And what's so special about you? Why do you have more authority? So Paul's upset about that. He defends his authority. He makes fun of these other apostles. He calls them super apostles, and this kind of stuff. And then finally, what is our Second Corinthians chapters 1 to 9 is Paul's response to their response to what is 2 Corinthians 10 to 13. So there's this, Corinthians gives you this big letter exchange, and then Paul's final answer to them is one of reconciliation, that they seem to have responded positively to his anger and told them to settle down or something, and they're still part of the community and they still respect them, and he's quite pleased with that. And that's the first 9 chapters of our 2 Corinthians. So it's an interesting correspondence. It sort of shows the history, and it shows us that we need to take Paul's letters as conversations in context. That's what Kelvin Rutzel said. That's one of the small books you can read on Paul's letters. It's called Conversations in Context. And it also allows us to understand that we can debate with Paul. It's certainly fine for us today to debate with Paul and to agree and disagree with him, and to have a community that's open and able to share opinion and reaction. You're not obliged to believe Paul. You don't have to. You're just part of this, whatever this movement is around the Christ assembly. That's how Paul understands it. You don't have to understand it that way, but he understands it as a Christ assembly. And you're just kind of part of it, but it's community. And if community doesn't give permission to debate, then it's not a healthy community. So that's what I wanted to represent. I agreed with Paul in a couple of instances, and I disagree with him in a couple of other instances. So we could do some conversation about that if you'd like. And if you find that completely boring, I've got something totally different I could talk about. Well,
let's see where this goes. We have the questions are coming in now.
Okay.
And I have one that isn't written out here, so it's a bit of a mystery. Arden, what is it you would like to ask?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Galston. And I feel like this lesson today is really quite relevant to what we in the United States are dealing with in terms of integrity and the idol of Trump. And that there are many people in positions of power who are, their assembly is requiring them to say things that they know are not true, namely that this election was rigged. But in order for them to keep their position, they have to say that it was rigged. And some people in the know that they don't really believe it, but others not in the know think that they're telling the truth. And those who have told the truth, who are in that assembly, are now risking the loss of their position. So this whole lesson for me raises a dilemma, which I believe is true, and that very often when we do the right thing, we risk losing something. Mm-hmm. And the question is, are we willing to lose that for the sake of the truth?
Yeah, I think that's really good and a really pertinent observation in that exchange. And you can see a lot depends on what the truth is in question. I think I intended to entitle this sermon, "A Little Knowledge is Better Than No Knowledge at All," with the idea that what is being perpetrated often in the Trump campaign or in the administration is no truth at all or no knowledge at all. And Paul is at least admitting to them that he believes they're right. He knows that they know, and he admits that he's on their side. I understand that. You got it right. Those are false so-called gods. And you're right to say that the meat really is pointless because they're not real anyway. So that's his context. So it's not quite identical to the Trump thing, but it does have that tangent there that connects, which is to what extent do those people so-called in the know have an obligation to return to the community and say, look, let's put the cards on the table. We in fact know that the election was not a fraud. It was a real election. Like that would be what they ought to do. And how are we going to deal with this? That's what should happen in Paul's community. These people who are able to sustain the community should really come in and say, look, we got to put our cards on the table. This is what's going on. This is why we have to do this. And what are we going to do about this? And the second element, I think you're absolutely right putting your finger on it. Sometimes you have to take a risk, and it is going to mean you're going to lose your position in civic society, and you're not going to have the privileges of wealth anymore because you're not going to have those connections that you have, and that's a risk. So these bring up interesting questions in this strange exchange, and I'm often surprised when you look at it on the surface. Meat sacrificed to idols, ancient world, what has that got to do with us? And yet it's amazing the kind of lines that you can draw in that exchange. And I think you put your finger on one that's really important.
Thank you.
Mike,
I have a question. This
I'm
is
sorry?
Bob Kaufman, and I have a question. Is there ever a time when you have to negate the truth and honesty? I maintain that everything is in jeopardy when you do.
You know, I can't really answer that question in a way, because it's sort of like everybody has to confront that in their own life. What are your lines of integrity? And I have put myself on the line occasionally when I was a minister in the United Church of Canada, and I began to say, I'm not going to lie anymore in the pulpit. I'm going to say that I really actually do not believe this. Like, for instance, I don't believe in the physical resurrection. And I'm very agnostic when it comes to the God questions. And I really think the historical Jesus research is important, and that we ought to say, this is what academic study theology is about, and this is the consequences, and there's no point in hiding this anymore. And so I took that risk, and you absolutely get shunned and condemned and criticized, and you're labeled dangerous, and you're just trying to be honest. And it's a strange thing. And then it makes me wonder what's going on in the church that we can't be honest. I mean, if there's any place in the world where you think you could be honest, it would be in your church, but you can't be. And it's, so, I think everyone has to judge for their own life. Where's the line of integrity? How much am I willing to say? What will it cost me? These are hard questions. And you see politicians dancing around this all the time. It doesn't matter whether they're Canadian politicians, American politicians, they're always dancing in answer to questions because they're trying to find the line that they can walk on where they satisfy enough people and don't get in jeopardy and don't isolate the party or the administration from the people. So I don't know that there's any answer to that ultimately. We just have to do the best we can.
Okay. Mike DiOrio expressed in his question the same kind of frustration with Paul and his letters that many of us have felt for years, I'm sure. But he goes on to ask whether there's some books that we can read that'll give us a better understanding of Paul and better perspectives with which to consider him.
Yeah, well, I guess naturally I'll refer to the West Star Institute, but Brandon Scott is one of the best scholars of the West Star Institute, best biblical scholars, and he wrote a book called The Real Paul. And it was published only 2 or 3 years ago, and he wrote it specifically to be accessible to the general public. And it's probably on Amazon, but you can certainly get it through the bookstore of weststarinstitute.org, or you can phone West Star. Bill Lato will be able to get it for you. The Real Paul by Brandon Scott. And it does introduce exactly the kind of controversies that are going on today in Paul and the new understanding of Paul that's emerging.
Llewellyn Lance Peterson would like you to expand a little bit on your comments about the physical resurrection.
Well, yes.
It's only an hour-long class.
So in Greek, there's there's distinctions that Greek has sometimes that we don't have. So an example of this is the way they can talk about time. They can talk about chronos and kairos. That's a classic example. Chronos is chronology. It's the process of time, or the unfolding of time. But kairos is the moment in time. And that we have to use more words to say that. Sometimes we say kairos and we borrow the Greek word, but we really mean the ripeness of time or the specialty of time. A great memory is a kairos moment. You can think about in your life when was a special moment or some turning point or something that you continue to fondly recall. And in resurrection, there is a similar thing. The Greeks have two words for the body. One is sarx, the flesh of the body, and one is soma. So it's this, which we translate as the spiritual body. It's not necessarily spiritual in the sense that it's immaterial. It's spiritual in the sense that it's your intention. It's your spirit, your character, the character body. And when Paul talks about the resurrection, he's talking about the character body. He's not talking about the flesh. So he means that you come alive again in Jesus, but you are restored as your character, as your integrity, as the person you're meant to be. That's what rises in Paul. And that's part of the promise of the new world. So that's tied in with the whole ending of time for Paul, the new creation. So you are part of the new creation, but it's your soma that is part of the new creation, not your flesh. So you'll see in Paul, what is sown is the flesh and what is raised is the spirit. You'll see that in Paul. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. That's the saying in Paul. That's what he means. It's your new person, your character person that is promised the new world, and that is part of the risen Christ. And Christ rises as this sort of ideal character of what a human being is and is meant to be in the world to come. He's the first sign of this world to come, this new reality. So you have to go back to antiquity and reimagine how Paul thinks about this. And that's basically how he thinks about it. And we might not think about it like that today. Like, for instance, I don't think the world's going to come to an end and there's a new world. And I just don't have those kinds of thoughts. But there's a certain kind of poetry in Paul when he talks like that. And the poetic meaning for us can be that there's this investment of hope, investment of a new time and a new type of humanity in Paul. And it can be very inspiring. It can push us forward to discover new things, to try to think of our way out of the problems we have today, to look at the crisis that is coming to us in the future. It's the ecological crisis. We'll be facing the crisis of climate change. We're going to have to do this as a new kind of humanity with a new understanding of the world. And so that kind of imagery you can retrieve from Paul, even if you can't retrieve his basic belief that God's going to end the world. I don't think that's necessarily worth needing to be retrieved from him. So when it comes to resurrection, I don't believe that some writers like John, the Gospel of John, you have the flesh of Jesus is very important. But this basically, I would say, belongs to the ancient way of trying to think about the death of Jesus and its significance. And in our time, we don't need to retrieve the literalness of that. We can retrieve the poetry of it. And Paul gives some hint of that poetry. It's this new character that's very important to him and this new world. And we can retrieve that because we need today a new character of humanity. And we are facing challenges for the earth that we have never faced in its history before. So I think these are valuable things.
M.J. Wiseman put in a comment followed by a question, really, that related to what we described her appreciating your reminders of the nature of the early church being quite different than what developed within a few hundred years, and asking if you'd care to amplify your comments on the nature of the early church, the early community.
Well, I'll just mention another book that's not published yet. It's going to be by Harper One. And I think it's going to be very important for this question. I believe it's going to be published November, possibly in early 2022, depending on the timing, but it's called After Jesus, Before Christianity. I think it will be really helpful for this question. So some of this question is actually new in a certain sense in scholarship. And what I would say is that the early movements of Christianity are scattered in the empire, and they're not really unified. There are many different flavors to these Christ assemblies. They don't call themselves Christianity. They're all assemblies, community assemblies. And the Gospels, if you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are flavors of these assemblies. They don't really know each other all that well. You get Paul, who's wandering around, and he has a collection of assemblies that he knows, but there's more than just Paul's assemblies. Paul does not know the assembly in Romans. He's writing a letter to them, but he doesn't know them. He wants to go to them. He wants to check out, will you support me? Because I want to go to Spain. That's his intention in Rome, in the Romans correspondence. We don't know if he ever makes it to Spain, or if he ever makes it to Rome. We don't know. But that seems to be his last letter where he's testing this community, this assembly in Rome that he's heard about. So I think overall, it's very hard to say what the early church was like prior to about the year 250 to 300. That's when we start to get examples of how it would be structured, bishops, priests, and elders kind of thing. That doesn't exist earlier. And secondly, the thing that we can retrieve from these early movements is that they're diverse. And so I think pluralism is a word we use today, but it's an adequate word for indicating what's the state of Christianity in the first couple of centuries. It's highly pluralistic. And that might help us, allow us to have our own experience today, to allow it to be pluralistic. We're all so different, and all the communities are different, denominations are different. Maybe the church could relax a little bit. Wouldn't it be nice? Stop believing you have the truth and allow for some pluralism and dialogue. I think that would make a big difference in the world.
It's probably a good time to remind everybody that, because I think I probably forgot to do this yesterday, but we did publish a list of your recommended readings on our website, and Laura Went's been kind enough to give us the link in the comment in the chat box. So if you're interested in following Dr. Galston's recommended reading list, why, there's a link in the chat box right now. I would suggest you grab it before you leave this. So it's available. It's also on our website someplace. I'm just not sure how to steer you there. I think this is the link to that. So there's that. Now, the next question is coming from Stephen Porter, and I'm going to let him ask it himself because I think I'm not going to do it justice again. Stephen?
Well, I think I'm commenting more than questioning, but I think that maybe what we haven't looked at in this discussion of the Corinthians passage is that Paul offers love as sort of a context or a vehicle, even a tool for I think for using our knowledge in a way that's sensitive to the weaknesses or the lack of knowledge of those who seem to possibly be led astray by not understanding our examples. So, I think, and I think also in the context of the historical Jesus, a significant portion, as I see it, of the message is the transcendency of love as the way to resolve all conflict, or actually to resolve all duality. And I think it's very useful to look at Paul's admonition in that context, that while we might not agree with him to say we need to dumb down for the benefit of those who might misunderstand, it's nevertheless useful for us to do so out of love.
Yes, I'm not sure if I need to answer that or because it's not so much a question, but there is in the Corinthians correspondence, just to build off of that question, there is the great 1 Corinthians 13. And I could say that it's interesting, if you'll notice in that portion of the letter, I don't think Jesus is actually mentioned, if I'm not mistaken. And it's thought that Paul didn't actually write that. He's got it from somewhere. It's a highly poetic piece of Greek, and it indicates to us the value that Paul could give writing that may not be emerging from the Christian assemblies. In other words, he can give value to something that's pagan, outside of it, and make use of it. So just in that, I guess that doesn't really address what Stephen is saying, but in a certain sense it does, because it's sort of a slight indication of being able to bridge a difference, not focusing on what the difference is, but focusing on what's similar and what's helpful. And I think that might be another good thing if we're thinking about the future of the movement, of Christian movement. That might be another good thought. We don't have to make an enemy out of paganism or other religions. They also have gifts.
If I can just respond, I also posted the comment that I believe that the advent of Jesus, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, maybe even Muhammad and some of the others, prophets of the axial age, is actually an evolutionary event, and that the future, I think we look to the humanity of these teachers. We look to not only do we maybe take them down from the pedestal and look at the clay, the human clay that they're made of, but we also look in the other direction, and we look at the fact that if we deified them, we reified them, and that maybe that's an encouragement for us to be inspired to look inside of ourselves for our own divinity, rather than to simply reduce these great teachers to some sort of baser humanity.
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm agreeing with you or not. I think I am, but I would say that I probably would just say it differently, I guess. But I think it's very important that all these great figures do have their humanity. I think we're agreeing with that. Yes, and that's good. And I think that I often think of Robert Funk's comment, which also got me in trouble because I made the mistake of repeating it in a religious context, and took that risk. But Bob said Jesus needs a demotion. So I said that once, but I think it's in the spirit of what you're saying, that actually the recapturing of his humanity is a very good thing for us, because then you can affirm our own humanity and make a connection there with what's possible.
But it liberates us to also affirm our own divinity.
Yeah, yes.
That's the flip side. Yeah.
Yes.
It is, it harkens back to that observation that if you believe the creeds, all of Jesus' life and teachings are contained in a comma. And,
yeah, that's right.
Let's see. All right, I'm fresh out of questions here from the chat room. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to pose?
I have a question.
Judy, that's right. All right.
My question is, we have from the Westar, we have books on Paul, we have books on Acts, we have books on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but we don't have any books on John. And the only study guides or whatever of John are Catholic. So is there somewhere in Westar Institute a scholar or more scholars that would like to take on John?
Boy, that's a good point. Thank you. All I can answer that by, I can only answer that by saying, I'll take that back to Westar. You're right. Because the question was the historical Jesus, the focus was on the synoptic gospels and Thomas. And there's very little on John. I think there's something, but I can't really recall. I think there's a translation of John. Well, there is a translation of John, of course, in the 5 Gospels. But there's two outstanding questions that Westar probably needs to deal with on the biblical side. And one is the dates of the Gospels. But I think now the second one is John. What do we have to say about John? So I'll take that back with me into the conversation of Westar.
Thank you.
Judy?
Okay. My question goes back to yesterday, David, and it is that you said we should think about Luke, the writer of Luke, as more a theologian and less a physician. Would you like to say more about how you all came to that conclusion?
Yes, I recall this is now a long time ago, 20 or 30 years ago, going through the arguments about why there is this tradition that Luke is a physician. And I don't remember much of that, except that the argument was more or less dismissed, that there's not really any strong evidence that Luke was a physician.
Oh.
There's some impression that the author might have been, but no more than being anything else, a historian. But in the long run, I think for the purposes of a community like this and conversation, these are identity questions. Who was Luke? I mean, those are really hard to answer, identity questions, because none of the Gospels are written in that way. So the better question is, what is Luke doing with the story? And that's why I said, you have to look at Luke as a theologian. What's the author doing with the story? That's really what we have in our hands. And that is another way to open up discussion. Again, you don't have to agree with Luke. This is how this author is choosing to tell the story and what the author's emphasizing, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily what we're going to do. However, we do have to develop ears to hear that author and to understand it. So the best course of action is to ask, what is the author doing with the story?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
I've got a great final question for you, Dr. Galston. I think it's maybe, we'll see what happens, but Nancy Morris asks, can there be a church that openly explores these questions and fashions of worship around them? What a segue, what a handoff.
Yes. Well, there can be. Like the little community I have in Hamilton here tries to be that kind of a community. It's sort of an assembly. It's not very large, but it tries to just do it honestly. And I think it really depends on the leadership you have of the community. Especially in mainline Christianity, most ministers or religious leaders have training in the academic study of the Bible and theology. It's not like there's a lack of that. If I mention a Q document to most ministers in the mainline tradition, they will know what I'm talking about. So it's really just a question of making this public and helping communities become comfortable with open discussion and recognizing that we don't know everything. It's not easy, you know. And not all answers fit all occasions. Not all truths are equal, so to speak, and that's okay. I mean, that's the reason why we explore together and we question and we doubt, and these are all healthy parts of a community. So I have noticed in my lifetime, and many have, that this kind of environment ends up being a small group within a church. They have this radical little Bible study that does stuff that they would never talk about in the broader community. And it's really, we need to sort of change that and get that little study group that's kind of radical and questioning into the pulpit, so that the community as a whole is given permission to question and to be honest with one another. And that's I think that's a promising future if we can manage that somehow.
In my last church, they called it the heretics class. But
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, the Hamilton.
All right. Here's an important question. George Gay wants to know who Hamilton was named after.
Yes.
Hamilton, Ontario was named after. Is it our guy on the $10 bill, or?
No, I'm sorry, it's not. But it was a Hamilton guy here, a Canadian Hamilton, who's a bit different, but one of the founders of this community. However, it's not bad. I mean, that's it would be amazing if some Canadian somehow got on the $10 bill in America. It would be interesting. But, you know, I should just argue or say that in closing, like I do a lot of work with communities in the United States, even though I'm Canadian myself. But there's great promise in the US, and it's very important, if I may encourage you as Americans, that because your economy is so big, I mean, sometimes I joke, if Canada had 350 million people, we would be a big concern to a lot of people, but we don't. We just have 30 million people. So, but you have a huge economy and a huge influence on the world, and certainly on the allies of the West. And the turn that you appear to be making in Biden, especially in relation to the climate crisis, I think is really, really positive and really, really important.
We have a problem?
So I hope you can begin to be the light again on the Statue of Liberty in going into the future.
Rich, I'm going to turn it back over to you because my internet connection is getting unstable. So,
well, we've recorded this session. If you want to go back and look at the session, I think it also records the chat. So we had 57 people signing on. So there's multiple couples on. So we probably around 70, 75 people this morning. So that's wonderful. We want to thank David Galston for being with us. I think it's only appropriate we turn to Judy and say, let you have the last word, Judy, and for you to dismiss us this morning. Would you do that?
Oh,
I will.
Rich, before we go, Karen wants to know where the recording is going to be posted.
Laura and Holly are posting on our website, I think. So all the recordings from yesterday are up too. So just watch for Laura or Holly to inform you, okay?
Bruce has a question too. Judy, you're holding
Yeah,
on a
Laura may have answered that question already on the chat. I see something down there. The
Yes.
name
Yes.
as listed above. Okay. Anyway.
Bruce Marion had a question.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment for the group. We talked with Nancy and Carol Spencer last night, and things are not good there. And I really think that it would be very helpful and encouraging for them if a bunch of us sent some cards off. I think they're in a time of need and need our prayers. So I posted their address on the chat line. So
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. And Ruth too. That's a tough time for them. I want to say a huge thank you to you, David Galston, for coming and being with us and encouraging us to ask questions, which is exactly part of the purpose of this series, and being the academician who helps us talk about some possible answers. A huge thank you, because you did all of that in real people talk, as somebody said to me, not academic talk. And that's enormous. There were a lot of people behind this first annual virtual weekend. And of course, an enormous thank you to each of them too, for the part that they played in all of this. I will send you forth with the hope that we can, again, to use David Galston's words, be the light at the top of the Statue of Liberty. Amen to that.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, everyone.
Judy.
All right. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.